Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. Some men go to prison and their families know where they are. They get the letters, the collect calls, the 30-minute visits behind glass. And it's a hard life, but it's a known life. But there's another kind of sentence, the one served by the families of the men who just disappeared. The hustlers who walk out the front door one night and never come back. They leave behind a different kind of cage. A cage made of questions with no answers. This is a story about a ghost like that. A man named Frankie and the son he left behind to search for him. His name was Elias. Frankie was a legend on the block. Not a killer, not a kingpin. He was a high-level earner, a man who moved in the shadows of the big players. He was smart, charismatic, with a laugh that could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. To his son Elias, who was 8 years old, he was a giant. He was the dad who would show up with unexpected gifts, a new bike, a pair of fresh Jordans. He was a man of magic and mystery. But to his wife Elena, he was a source of constant low-level anxiety. She knew the life he lived as she saw the late nights, the hushed phone calls, the men in expensive cars who would wait for him on the corner. She loved the man, but she hated the game. "Frankie, when is it going to be enough?" she'd ask him. And he'd just kiss her, that easy, confident smile on his face. "Almost there, baby," he'd say. "One more big score, and we're out." It's the oldest lie in the hustle, the promise of one more. The day he disappeared started like any other. Elias woke up to the smell of his father's cologne, a smell of leather, and a faint, sharp spice. Frankie was in the kitchen, making pancakes, a rare treat. He was in a good mood, laughing, teasing Elias, stealing kisses from Elena. For a few hours, they were just a normal family. Before he left for school, Frankie pulled Elias aside. He gave him a small silver compass on a leather cord. "So you'll always know your way home," he said, his voice serious for a moment. Elias put it around his neck. It felt like a sacred object, a piece of his father's magic. That night, Frankie was getting ready to go out. He had a meeting, he said, a big one. The one that was going to be the last one. Elena's face was tight with a worry she couldn't hide. "Be careful, Frankie." He just smiled, kissed her. "Always." He knelt down in front of Elias. "You be the man of the house while I'm gone, you hear me?" Elias puffed out his chest. "Yes, sir." Frankie smiled, ruffled his hair, and walked out the door. Elias watched from the window as his father got into a car with two other men and drove off into the night. He never came back. The first night, Elena just thought he was working late. She sat up waiting, the hours ticking by. By the second day, the worry had turned to a cold, creeping panic. She started making calls to his friends, his associates. No one knew anything, or if they did, they weren't talking. She went to the police, but they were no help. "Ma'am," the detective said, his voice tired and different. "Your husband is a known player in the game, and these guys, they disappear sometimes. He'll probably turn up when he's ready." But he didn't. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. And Frankie, the man who had been a giant in their lives, faded into a ghost. The whispers on the street gave them no answers. Some said he had run off with another woman. Some said he had been arrested by the feds. Some said he was at the bottom of a river. Elias was left with a hole in his life the size of a father. He would hold the silver compass in his hand at night, a cold, useless reminder of a promise his father couldn't keep. He didn't just lose his dad, he lost his sense of direction. His true north was gone, and he and his mother were left to navigate the wilderness of their new life, a life defined by a single and devastating question. What happened to the disappearing dad? Years passed, the hole that Frankie left in their lives didn't heal. It just changed shape. Elena worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Her grief, a quiet, constant companion. She never spoke of Frankie in the past tense. He was always just gone, as if he might walk through the door at any moment. Elias grew up in the shadow of his father's ghost. The story of the disappearing dad became a neighborhood legend, and Elias, as his son, inherited a complicated legacy. He was the son of a king, a respected earner, and he was the son of a man who had abandoned his family. He didn't know which version of his father to believe in, so he just existed in the space between. By the time he was 16, the questions that had been dormant in him for years began to wake up. He needed to know. He needed to understand the man who had been a giant in his childhood and a ghost in his adolescence. He started his own quiet investigation. He started with his mother. But she was a dead end. She had locked that part of her life away, and she didn't have the key anymore. It doesn't matter, Elias, she'd say. He's gone. We have to live for the future, not the past. But for Elias, the past was a puzzle he had to solve, so he went to the streets. He started hanging around the old neighborhood, listening to the stories of the old heads, the men who had known his father. They spoke of Frankie with a mix of reverence and caution. They told him stories of his father's brilliance, his charm, his ruthlessness. They painted a picture of a man who was always playing a long game and a man who was always 2 steps ahead. But when Elias asked them what happened, where he had gone, a wall of silence went up. The street code was thick. No one wanted to talk about a ghost. But Elias was persistent. He had his father's charm and his mother's quiet determination. He started to piece together the fragments, the whispers. He learned that his father had been involved in a big score, a deal that was supposed to be his last one. He learned that he had been working with a crew from out of town, and he learned that there had been a betrayal. He found one of his father's old lieutenants, a man named Pops, now an old broken man running a small failing auto body shop. Pops was scared at first, but he saw the look in Elias's eyes, the same fire he had seen in his father's, and he decided to tell him the truth. "Your father was a good man, kid," Pops said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "But he was too trusting. He got into business with the wrong people, a crew from Philly. They were talking about a big drug shipment. Your father put up the buy money. It was supposed to be the score that set you all up for life." Pops lit a cigarette, his hands shaking. But the Philly crew, they had other plans. They weren't here for a partnership. They were here for a takeover, and your father, he was in their way. Pops told him the name of the man who had led the Philly crew, a man named Isaiah. He was a ghost too, Pops said. No one had seen him in years. But he gave Elias the name of one of his lieutenants, a man who was now doing a long bit in the state penitentiary. Elias had a name, a lead. It was the first real piece of the puzzle he had ever held. He knew what he had to do. He had to go to the prison. He had to talk to this man. He had to follow the paper trail of his father's ghost, even if it led him into the belly of the beast. He was no longer just a boy, haunted by the past. He was a detective, and he was getting closer to a truth that was far darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The prison visiting room was a world Elias had only seen in movies. The air was thick with a strange mix of cheap disinfectant and a low humming desperation. He sat at a small table, his hands sweating, and waited. He was about to come face to face with a man who might hold the key to his father's disappearance. The man who walked in was older, harder than Elias had expected. His name was Marcus, and he had the dead, empty eyes of a man who had been in a cage for a long, long time. He sat down across from Elias, his face a mask of suspicion. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Elias," he said. I'm Frankie's son. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. A flicker of something, surprise, fear, regret, passed through his eyes. Frankie, he said, the name a ghost on his lips. I ain't heard that name in a long time. Elias leaned forward. I need to know what happened to him, he said. Pops told me about the deal with the Philly crew. He told me about Isaiah. Marcus was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room as if the ghosts of the past were right there, listening. Finally he spoke, his voice a low, careful whisper. You're playing a dangerous game, kid. Some things are better left buried. He was my father, Elias said, his voice thick with a raw and desperate emotion. I have to know. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw the same fire, the same stubborn determination that he had seen in Frankie's eyes all those years ago. And he made a decision. Your father was a good man, he said. He was a square dealer in a crooked game, and that's what got him killed. The words, when they finally came, were a simple and brutal confirmation of what Elias had always suspected. His father wasn't just gone, he was dead. He had been murdered. Marcus told him the story about the deal, the betrayal, the night Frankie had disappeared. Isaiah and his crew, he said, they never had any intention of doing a deal. They just wanted your father's buy money, and they wanted his territory. They set him up, and they met him at a warehouse down by the docks, and they killed him. Elias sat there, the story washing over him in a cold and numbing tide. He had spent his whole life wondering, and now the truth was a brutal and ugly thing. Where is he? Elias asked, his voice a whisper. Where's his body? Marcus shook his head. No one knows. They made him disappear. That's their specialty. But he gave Elias something else. A name. The name of the man who had been Isaiah's right hand. The man who had, according to the street, pulled the trigger. A man named Simon. And Simon, Marcus told him, was no longer a ghost. He was back in the city, running his own crew, a king on a throne that had been built on the bones of Elias's father. Elias walked out of that prison with a new and dangerous purpose. He wasn't just a boy searching for his father's ghost anymore. He was a son seeking justice for his father's murder, and he knew with a chilling certainty that the path he was now on was not a path of discovery. It was a path of revenge. And it was a path that was going to lead him into the same dark and deadly world that had swallowed his father whole. The name Simon was a key, and it unlocked a whole new and darker chapter of Elias's search. He started to dig, to ask questions in places he had no business being. He was no longer just a kid with a ghost story. He was a man on a mission, and the streets started to notice. He found out where Simon ran his operation. A series of storefronts, a nightclub, a network of street-level dealers. Simon was a big player now, a man who had built an empire on the ashes of Elias's father. Elias knew he couldn't go at him direct. He was just a kid. Simon was a killer, surrounded by killers. So he started to do what his father had done. He started to think, to plan, to play a long game. He got a job as a busboy at the nightclub that Simon owned. He was a ghost again, invisible, watching, listening. He learned the rhythms of Simon's operation and the names of his lieutenants, the flow of his money. He was a spy in the enemy's camp. His mother, Elena, was terrified. She saw the change in him. The quiet, thoughtful boy was gone, replaced by a young man with a cold and dangerous fire in his eyes. Elias, please, she begged him, let it go. Your father is gone. Don't let him take you too. But he couldn't let it go. It was more than just revenge now. It was about honor. It was about legacy. It was about making his father's ghost rest. He started to feed anonymous tips to the police, small, carefully chosen pieces of information. A license plate number here, a drop location there. He was a phantom disrupting Simon's operation from the inside. 1,000 tiny cuts that were starting to make the giant bleed. Simon knew something was wrong. He was losing money, losing product. He had a rat in his organization, and the paranoia started to set in. He started to look at his own men with suspicion, and the trust that held his empire together began to crumble. Elias was playing a dangerous game. One slip, one mistake, and he was dead. But he was his father's son. He had a gift for the game. And he was driven by a righteous fury that made him fearless. The final move was a work of art. Elias learned about a massive shipment of drugs that Simon was expecting. He fed the information to the police, but he also fed a different piece of information to Simon's number 2 man. A piece of information that made it look like Simon was setting him up to take the fall. The night of the shipment, it all came to a head. The police raided the warehouse, seizing the drugs and arresting a half dozen of Simon's men. And at the same time, the betrayal that Elias had so carefully orchestrated exploded within Simon's own crew. The number 2 man, thinking he was about to be sacrificed, went to the feds and gave them everything. The whole empire, including the cold case murder of a hustler named Frankie a decade ago. They came for Simon the next morning. He was at his nightclub counting his losses. When the feds stormed in, he didn't even try to run. He just sat there, a king on a crumbling throne, as the empire he had built on a foundation of betrayal came crashing down around him. Elias watched it all from across the street. He saw them lead Simon away in cuffs. He felt a surge of triumph, of victory. He had done it. He had gotten justice for his father. But as he stood there, watching the flashing lights, the feeling of triumph was replaced by a cold and empty silence. He had won. But what had he become in the process? He had used the same tactics as the men he was hunting. He had become a master of the same game that had killed his father. The ghost was at rest, but Elias was now haunted by a new one, his own. The fall of Simon's empire was a big story. The newspapers were filled with it. The feds had taken down one of the biggest drug operations in the city's history. And it was all because of a ghost, a faceless, anonymous informant. Elias watched it all unfold from a distance. He had his justice, his revenge, but it was a hollow victory. He had spent so many years consumed by his father's ghost, he didn't know how to live for himself anymore. He was a man without a mission. He quit his job at the nightclub. He tried to go back to a normal life, but he was a changed man, and he had walked through the dark, and it had left its mark on him. He saw the world in a different way now. He saw the lies, the angles, the hustles everywhere. His mother, Elena, saw the change in him too. The fire of his quest was gone, and in its place was a quiet and profound sadness. She tried to reach him, to pull him back into the light, but he was adrift, a ship without a rudder. He started to drink. He started to gamble. He started to walk the same dangerous edges that his father had walked. He wasn't a hustler. He wasn't a killer. He was just lost. One night, he found himself back at that bar, the one where he had almost gotten into a fight. He was playing poker, losing money he didn't have, and he saw him, Pops, the old-timer who had been one of his father's men. Pops looked at him, his eyes full of a weary wisdom. "You got him, kid," he said. "You got justice for your father." "So what now?" Elias just shrugged, took a long pull from his beer. "I don't know." "Your father, he was a good man," Pops said, "but he was consumed by the game. He thought he could control it, but in the end it controlled him. Don't let that happen to you, kid. Don't let his ghost be your ghost." The words hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his whole life defined by his father's absence, and now he was in danger of being defined by his father's choices. He had won the war, but he was about to lose himself. He walked out of that bar, And for the first time in a long time, he thought about the future. His future, not his father's. He knew he had a choice. He could let the darkness that had consumed his father consume him too, or he could find a different path, a path of his own making. It was the same choice his father had faced a lifetime ago. And in that moment, standing on that dark and lonely street corner, Elias finally understood the true and tragic weight of his own legacy. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.